A black book operation has came under light as a satellite long since thought to be defunct has started transmitting from none other than the orbit of Titan. This has elicited quite a bit of interest from the parties that would otherwise be capable of doing it. In this case, it is NASA and the former Soviet space program operating under the UN. And as both sides rapidly try to decrypt the failing transmission that's coming from Titan, they also ignite their programs as the Soviet Union starts off the Orion project, once again using its nuclear munitions as a propellant device to give them a kickstart into a long-range program all the way out to the outer edges of our solar system. Now in this game, taking the Orion project can be a bit of a gamble. It's big, it's heavy, and on the other end, Defiler takes the Vasmir plasma thruster and he starts going with a more conventional technology, giving NASA a very stable run, even if the power output on that thruster isn't quite as great or as efficient as the Orion project. Now we already see two strategies. NASA is taking a tried and true method of using lots of fuel, lots of thrusters, and a reliable research pattern, while I have gone for a more aggressive setup because I just can't resist the Orion project. I mean, nuclear weapons. And as a result, it ends up being kind of problematic to implement, especially early in the game. I start cycling through the cards as fast as I can, trying to get to the ones that I absolutely need to make a platform that functions properly. While meanwhile, NASA is taking a look at the research cards that are coming up and making sure that I pay dividends for it, because every time I thrust something into orbit, he takes a launch fee from it and ends up using it against me, just bidding against everything that I research so that I have to pay more for it, and in many cases, I don't have the water tokens to launch the stuff into orbit to build the rocket that I need. However, the research cards do tend to favor me to some degree. The rocket ends up being marginally useful as I pull all the cards necessary to actually make it function. NASA, on the other hand, with its tried and proven method of using a very simple thruster setup, has already made itself to the moon, and using its rocket is capable of scanning the moon and taking a claim for NASA, giving it the first potential colonization sites for NASA and leaving the UN further behind the tech track for taking an aggressive technological route. But we're both vet players, we've played this game many times, and I start using his bidding strategy against him. As I see a cheap refinery come up, I go ahead and I absolutely need it. It's the next card in the stack. He tries to bid against it to take it away from me, or at least make me pay for it, and I let him have it. And it just so happens that the last trip to the moon just tapped out his resources and leaves it free and clear for the UN to pull up the cheap solar refinery and practically hand them one of the most powerful cards in the game because NASA got really aggressive with its bidding strategy. But he takes it on the chin, he revitalizes the refinery, ends up using it even though he didn't really want it, and prepares to launch his first colony. And as I see this is happening, the cosmonauts load up their nuclear-powered fun machine and thrust their way to the moon before NASA can, placing down the first lunar colony and taking it out from right underneath them by the skin of their teeth. NASA quickly follows suit, but their program, relying on a thruster that is not quite as efficient as the Orion project, requires them to cannibalize the ship as it lands because they don't have the ability to keep the ship there, or at least refuel it and send it back. And it allows the Russians to drop off their colonists, drop off their equipment, and using that massive platform, thrust back out of the lunar envelope. This is one of those fantastic get-out-of-jail-free cards that the Orion project allows thrusting out of immense gravity wells, and it's also one of the reasons that it was cancelled in the 60s. Once the initial prototypes were made and thrown over to JFK for approval, he just happened to have a Marine Corps general, I do believe, right there, and he took one look at it and he saw it as an immense transglobal landing platform that could have wrote the Navy out of all their operations. And JFK did not want to accelerate the arms race at all and had the thing scrapped immediately. But the system is operational, and we go ahead and launch it off. The UN puts the cosmonauts in there, irony as it is, and uses it for a peaceful purpose. We take it out to Ceres, the dwarf planet in our asteroid belt that's roughly a quarter the size of the moon. We don't have to stop at Mars now because it is an incredibly valuable platform. It's heavy, it's got a lot of thrust, it can carry a lot with it. We have to cannibalize a little of the ship to make the colony work out there, but having a colony out in the asteroid belt this early on gives a huge leg up to the Russians out there in the high frontier. Meanwhile, back at the home front, NASA begins revitalizing their thruster program for a long-range mission to the asteroid belt, and disaster strikes as the system detonates in orbit, taking the rocket with it and leaving them significantly disadvantaged as they have to rebuild the entire program from scratch. And that, they say, is significant, as the loss of their program at this particular time could not have happened at a worse moment. Their program relied completely on a slow, steady, and between us, a completely proven approach to get out to the solar system. And they got struck by the worst of luck. Meanwhile, the Russian program flies back. We send the Orion project back unmanned, leaving the colonists on Ceres to load up with another refinery, more colonists, and we're going to thrust back out into the far end of the asteroid belt, further along the high frontier, because we're going to make another base further along the asteroid belt to get closer at striking distance at Jupiter and Saturn. And as the NASA program begins revitalizing itself and moving on with its program, the UN drops off more cosmonauts on Ceres, starts to refuel, and begins their trek further into the asteroid belt. We are well beyond the means of most games, as we are now completely within the realm of having to refuel ourselves in the far distant expanses of space. There's nothing to help us out there if we make a horrible decision or are a little short-sightedness. Now planning becomes incredibly important. And as it is incredibly important to plan logistically for the long run and able to get higher and higher into the solar system, NASA finally begins scanning the rocks of the asteroid field in order to find water-bearing materials for their forward operations and bases in the high frontier so that they may be able to continue further along. At this point, they need a forward operating base in order to keep doing any kind of recon or any kind of search and to keep up with the Russians. And as they do find water on the asteroid Vesta and lay down their roots, setting up a refinery and beginning a refueling operation for other rockets that are going to pass through the asteroid belt. And as the UN program got a little risky, using a mission profile that was actually very narrow in its ability to respond to any kind of disaster, disaster almost strikes, taking down the platform as it just narrowly avoids complete destruction at the hands of a misguided thrust attempt. You gotta be a little careful when you're using nuclear weapons as your thrust source. Nonetheless, they do make it to asteroid 154 Bertha, which they did find water on, and they colonized it immediately, setting up a refinery with that cheap refinery card that they managed to wrestle away from NASA in the early game through a cunning bit of negotiation. Being so far from home, the UN has a couple gambits in play. Namely, it wants to move further out. We have the capability of refueling and resourcing everything that we need in the upper asteroid belt, so instead of going all the way back to Earth to pick up new colonists, the Orion project heads right back to the previous Ceres installation and picks up the colonists on that outpost. NASA begins another wave of colonists as their rocket has to be rebuilt every time they colonize something, and it's become a huge hampering effect on their space program. something that would be mitigated if the UN program was launching things forward every turn and paying forward the dividends to the NASA space program, but they're not. At this point, we are resourcing and building everything in the asteroid belt. And with every thrust, it becomes more and more of a gamble, this time just barely edging out and finding resources on their last stop before they start planning their thrust all the way out to Saturn. Now at this point, again, very, very far from home. We're talking hundreds of millions of miles here. They decide that they're not going to go back and pick up all the resources that they need. They're going to resource all the resources that they need, all the life support items and all the water that they need from the asteroid out there without deploying the factory. Instead, they keep the factory packed up. They're going to go for the gold. They're going to go straight for Titan. They pick up the resources they need, and they begin moving forward. NASA takes the time, pushes forward with their second wave, and starts moving out into the asteroid belt to get another station that's just a little bit higher, first stopping off at their previous outpost to refuel. But it's just a little too late as the UN program begins considering their long haul, making a long-range thrust, making a gravity assist through Jupiter's moons into the outer set of the solar system. Any little screw up at this point will leave them stranded, so they have to plan it very, very carefully. And as they do, they make it all the way into Saturn's inner system, swinging by their moons, getting another gravity assist. We elect not to aero brake through any of the atmospheres. It's just a risk we don't need to take because we have the Orion project. And we just start using nuclear detonations to cushion our fall directly, avoiding any problems. And we end up landing on Titan, taking the game. We landed on Titan, in the expanded game no less. That is quite an accomplishment, and we were quite proud of that, even though we were doing it in a competitive game. There was a lot of things that NASA just went wrong. Their initial strategy with the Vasmir rocket generally works, but they were really, really hampered by that pad explosion and losing out on that solar-powered refinery, because from there I was able to build refineries in the asteroid belt and then just push forward very cheaply and very, very quickly. Altogether, it was a good game. And thanks for watching. Besides, I wonder what that probe was actually sending out. I guess we'll never know. Though, if you are curious, it is an SSTV transmission similar to the ones that the Voyager sent.